So firstly, a very warm welcome to you all for the return of My Story after a 6-week break. It's good to see you and a few new faces for this our 20th My Story. As usual, please make sure that you remain muted so we don't disrupt Amanda. This week's guest speaker is Amanda Weinberg, and she will be talking about her new novel, The Tears of Monterini, a project that has taken Amanda many years to research and write. The Tears of Monterini is Amanda's first novel. She studied modern languages at the University of East Anglia, followed by a PGCE at King's College London. She ran a company in international advertising sales and now teaches French and German. She lives in London with her husband Julian and her family, and spends a lot of time, although possibly not this year, in Pitigliano, Italy, the setting for the Monterini in the title. The book is inspired by true events in beautiful Tuscany and the Emilia-Romagna area. Amanda was a member of South Hampstead 27 years ago before moving to the suburb. So as I hand over the virtual microphone to you, Amanda, I'd just like to say thank you very much for talking to us this morning, and a very big welcome back to South Hampstead Synagogue.
Thank you, Lawrence, and thank you everybody for being here this morning to listen to my story and for inviting me to take part in My Story, which sounds like a fantastic group of talks that you organise. I'm here to talk about my book, The Tears of Monterini. I don't know if some of you may have read it. It came out in August this year, right in the middle of the pandemic, which is not a brilliant time to launch a book. In some ways, it is quite a nice time because people have got a bit more time to read, but much more difficult in terms of marketing. What I really wanted to talk about today was the inspiration for my book. And in order to do that, I've got a little slideshow, but please bear in mind, I'm not great with sharing the screen. So if it goes a bit wrong, just have patience with me. Okay, so I'm going to take you back to a time in 1998, which was when Julian and I, my husband and I, first discovered the most fantastic village in Italy. And we knew very little about Italy. We'd both been there on a vacation with family when we were much younger. I think I went there when I was about 20 for the first time. And we tended to travel to France. So my degree was in French and German. I did Italian as a subsid, but it wasn't my major language at all at the time. So we used to go on holiday every year to France. And then one year I just happened to mention to my neighbor at the time, who was an Italian woman living next door us, if she knew somewhere we could rent in Italy. And she came up with a friend of a friend who had an apartment in a tiny village in an area called the Maremma. So we tried to look up about the Maremma and about this village. And it was in 1998, which was really before the internet had taken off. And what happened was we had this dial-up CompuServe, which some of you may remember, had to sit there for hours dialing up, trying to get information. And we found absolutely nothing about the Maremma, apart from the fact there were horses in the Maremma, and that's all we knew. So we were going to this particular area, knew nothing about it. So my husband bought a guidebook, which said, avoid southern Tuscany, really boring, don't go there, nothing to see, just stay in the north, to the areas of the north. And we thought, oh, that's a bit of a shame. We booked this up. So we thought, right, we'll go anyway. So we packed our children, who were quite young, 6 and 8 at the time, packed them in the car and started our journey through Europe, through France and Switzerland, through central Italy to the village of Pitigliano, which was where we were renting this apartment, knowing nothing about it. So bear in mind, we were told that this is a very boring place to go to. There's nothing to see, avoid it. It's dreadful. So please bear that in mind when I show you the first photograph of this particular village. So we're driving through central Italy. We're on a road, which is a very straight, narrow road. And very suddenly the road swerves to the right. And as it swerved to the right, there's a church just on the left, swerve to the right, and then the most incredible view pops out in front of you. And we just turned the corner and we saw this magical explosion of golden colored houses, all perched one on top of the other in a beautiful valley. And this was the place we were told was really boring, there's nothing to do. So I'm just going to share my screen and show you the very first view. There we go.
Wow.
I'm trying to do the full screen, but I'm not able to. Can you see that? Can everybody see it? Okay, so this was what we saw. Now, it doesn't really, the photo doesn't really give it justice, but it really was the most beautiful sight. It's a medieval town built in the 13th, 14th centuries, absolutely stunning. And it pops out very golden on a mound of tufa rock, which you can just see at the bottom, which we later discovered was Etruscan. It's full of Etruscan tombs and pathways and houses, really beautiful. So we stood there for several minutes. The children were completely awe-inspired. I mean, all our faces, our mouths just dropped. We couldn't believe what we were seeing. And we just stood there in silence, actually. It was just this most magical, magical vision. And we thought, gosh, we're really lucky, how beautiful. What we didn't realize was there was the most incredible history and culture, in Jewish history and culture, that we had no idea of. So I'm going to carry on with my next. So this is just the back. This is the back view of the town as well. You can see it's actually really beautiful. I'm going to go to 4 here. So what happened was we drove through the town, round the winding road. And the first thing we saw as we just approached the center of the town to park the car was this sign, synagogue. And we looked at each other and we thought, where have we landed? Not only is this town stunning and beautiful and awe-inspiring and magical, there's a synagogue. And we thought, this is very, very weird. What's happened? So we parked our car and started walking to the address. It's a little bar where we were supposed to meet the lady who was renting the flat to us. And we started walking along. I'll stop sharing my screen for a second. Okay. So we parked the car and we started walking down little side roads to the main square. And in the shops around, we saw kosher wine. And then we saw matzah, which was all wrapped up with special little paper and ribbons, and it's called panem asimo in Italian. And we saw the kosher wine and the matzah and these amazing packets of Jewish delicacies, really, and different cakes and specialities. And we thought, this is a very, very unusual place. It's obviously extremely unique. It's not known. We didn't know anything about it. We didn't have mobile phones in those days, but we had managed to find a phone box, and we made a call to Julian's father, who knew masses about Jewish history, and he had every single copy of the Encyclopedia Judaica ever. So he looked it up in his Encyclopedia Judaica and said, there's absolutely nothing about Pitigliano here, which was another strange revelation for us, that we had actually arrived somewhere unique, very special, very unknown. And that moment on became an inspiration for me. I suppose I fell in love, and I think as a family, we fell in love with this very, very special place. And we decided that we would come back the following year, and we bought somewhere there. And so in a way, my story, which is very much inspired by this village, is in a way a love story to the village. It's a love story within it, but it's also my love story to the village that I fell in love with in 1998. So I'll just take you back to my screen. So this was the sign of the synagogue. And we started our walk through. I'll just show you. So this is the main square. We walked through the main square and we started walking through these beautiful streets that some of you who may have read my book will know that the two main characters live in an area called La Fratta, and this is the Fratta. And the one on the left is one of the typical streets in the Fratta with these lovely little balconies and terraces. And it wasn't the first year that I was there, probably the second year, that the idea for a novel started to percolate in my brain. And I almost saw my two main characters, Jacopo and Angelo, sitting in one of these streets, full of flowers, very close together. The houses are literally perched one on top of the other, all hicklety-picklety. And the one on the right is the street that we live in, actually, and the flowers belong to my neighbour opposite. So our house is just like a door, and it goes right down into a cave, which was originally Etruscan. But it's all extremely beautiful, very unique, really lovely place. But the most incredible thing was discovering this Jewish culture and Jewish history in the town. So let me go back for a moment. So what happened next was then we decided to go and see the synagogue, and we became quite friendly with the individuals in the town. There was one Jewish woman who remained when we were there. She has a son and a nephew, but they aren't so involved in the Jewish life of the town, but she really was. And we became very friendly with her. And bit by bit, we became friendly with other people around, all the old ladies and gentlemen who lived in the Frata and in the ghetto. And I started to glean stories from that period. And I started to do some research. And my research took me way back to when Jews first arrived in the 16th century. They were mainly expelled from the papal states. There were the papal bulls in 1555 and 1569. And they expelled Jews from all the papal states. So they started to arrive, they moved up to Tuscany. And in Pitigliano, unusually, there was a very lovely count called Count Orsini, who was very happy to embrace Jews and allowed them to come to Pitigliano. And these Jews arrived, and the thing that was so special about Pitigliano, it was mainly a town of contadini, which translates as peasants, but it's not a particularly nice name. So you could really say farmers. So the town was really farmers, and the Jews who arrived were, was a famous doctor actually, who became the doctor to the Count Orsini, but they were more artisans and tailors. And so there was no competition between the Jews and the citizens, the Catholics of Pitigliano. So even from the very beginning, they were really, really united, and they lived together very comfortably, very happily, right the way through all kinds of traumas. I think there was a rebellion in the 18th century to do with the French that tried to annex that part of Tuscany, and the Jews and the Catholics worked very much together to keep the town free from the French in that period. And this carried on, and I just found this interesting, very, very interesting and very unique, hearing about this Catholic-Jewish bond. And that seemed to extend right the way through the eras, even to the fascist era, which was the era that interested me the most, because it was the most recent era. And I thought what happened to Italy during the war was very different from what happened in Germany or Poland or Austria or any of the other countries in Europe. And it was a very different story. And I started to talk to people and to research, and I got lots and lots of information that I put together and decided to use in my novel. And then I started to weave it through the characters that I invented. And my characters they are invented, they are my inventions, but what happens to them happened to the real characters of Pitigliano that I met. For those of you that have read the book, I do talk about a villa, which was a story that occurred in Emilia-Romagna. This is a true story. It's based on the story of Villa Emma. I call it Villa Sofia. And I put that story into my account of Monterini, which I gave it the name because I didn't want it to just be about Pitigliano. As I started researching, I could see that there were very interesting things that happened in neighboring areas, like Emilia-Romagna, and also in Rome as well. So my research extended, and the story of the villa was actually given to me by a close friend at the time, who told me about this. And I was doing a creative writing course at the City Lit, and I wrote the story of the villa as a short story. I had been reading them parts of the novel that I was in the process of writing. I read them about the villa, And they all said, no, 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 this has to be in your novel. You've got to put this in your novel. So the villa became part of my novel. And I wove the story around Bella and Rico, another two of the main characters, and they were the ones responsible for the villa. But all the things that happen in the villa actually really happened. It was a very interesting story, because if you bear in mind that Italy was a fascist country, they were working, Mussolini was very much attuned to all the racist laws that Hitler had put in place. He had to do what Hitler said, although he was the founder of fascism in a way before Hitler. Hitler was really his little sidekick to begin with, and then things started to change. The Nazi salute comes from the Roman salute, which was Mussolini's idea. He brought that back from the Romans, and Hitler actually copied that. So a lot of the things that we think of as being very German were originally Italian and fascist. And so we're bearing in mind this is a fascist country, and an organization called De La Sem, which is a Jewish organization, managed to bring in orphans from the former Yugoslav Republic, some from Germany as well. And they brought these children, and they were orphans of Jewish, Roma, and communist parents. And they were brought in to Italy. Of course, they brought in by boat originally, and they were hidden in a villa. And the aim was to hide them as Catholics and to teach them the local dialect, so that they could then pretend they were Catholics. And when the coast was clear, they would then get them on a boat and send them to Palestine. So what they did in the villa was they started to teach them how to farming methods, so that they would eventually be able to go to a kibbutz and work as pioneers in Israel. And that actually happened. And they were, at the end of the war, they managed to get out of Italy. It was quite a long, arduous journey, which I don't go into too much in my story, but they did eventually get to Israel, which is really amazing, considering we are talking about a fascist country. So the thing that I found very interesting was the fascist government closed their eyes. They kind of knew what was going on, but they closed their eyes to this villa. And I think the thing that's worth noting at this point I can mention is that the Italians were very, very anti, the fascist government was very against the anti-fascists. It wasn't so much the Jews that they were against, it was the anti-fascists. So until 43, till the Germans came in, the Jews were in this area, in Tuscany and Emilia-Romagna. It's a bit different in the north, but in the area that I'm talking about, they were relatively free. They could manage their lives fairly well, even though there were the racial laws. And I found that very, very interesting when I talked about it with the individuals in Pitigliano, and I did my research, that they were really helped during this very difficult time of losing. After the racial laws, they lost their jobs if they were working in the government as teachers or musicians or actors or doctors. They did lose their jobs. You were fine if you were self-employed, but if you're employed by the state, you lost your job. And what was so interesting was how the villagers, they came together and they made sure they were fed, and they made sure they had provisions for their schools. And I found these stories of individual acts of kindness so fascinating and interesting, and very different from many of the things that you hear about that occurred in Germany or Poland. And although there are all amazing acts of kindness throughout Europe at this time, this was an entire village that came together because the village considered the Jewish history and culture part of their lives. And when we first came to the village, and we bought the house and people discovered we were Jewish, they would come up to us and take our hands and kiss it and say, "I'm just so happy that you're here." And people, even now, when people say, "Oh, I've just heard you're Jewish," that's so amazing, because they considered the synagogue complex and they considered the history to be part of their history. And people come up to me like this, and I say this in the book as well: we are combined. Your culture is our culture. And that was just something that I found so fascinating. Particularly, I suppose, I mean, we've all maybe come across some form of anti-Semitism. I, as a child, we've all had the Corbyn situation very recently here. And to be in a town where people just love the fact that you are Jewish was, I thought, just so special and so inspiring. So that's how my story actually began because I loved the town and I loved what they did during the war and even before, throughout the centuries. And I wanted to write something very special about that era. Sorry about my phone. Let me go back to sharing my screen. Okay, so this was the Fratta. Let's go to the next. 1 second. Okay, so this is the synagogue. And if I do this, I think you'll get an easier picture. Can everybody see it? There we are. There's the synagogue. This is the arch that I talk about leading to the synagogue in Pitigliano. You can just about see, if you look through the arch, you've got the gate there. Just above it is a white building. And that was the building during the fascist era when they, after the racial laws in 1938, where they made a school for the Jewish children that weren't allowed to study anymore in the public schools. And I use that in my book as well. They have a school where they teach the children from Pitigliano who can't actually study anymore. And the story of Bella, where she sees Michele, she's actually taking her maturita, which is the exam at the end of the school years, at the end of 18, and she takes it in the corridor. And this is what happened to many of the Jewish kids. They weren't allowed to take their exams. They were still allowed to take them, but not with the other people in the school. They were relegated to the corridor. And I actually spoke to a friend of mine, Laura, her father, she lives in London. Her father was from the Torino area, which was it was a lot harder for Jews there, I think, than Emilia-Romagna and Tuscany. But he told me that there was a sense of pride in being able to teach yourself and have your own school and do the exam on your own. But there was this sense of pride that they did feel. And I thought that was very interesting as well. And my character, Jacopo, reflects that sense of pride in actually being able to make sure that the children were educated despite the racial laws, being able to carry on working if you were self-employed and supporting those that couldn't. Sorry, my doorbell. Okay, so this is the inside of the synagogue. So there's a picture on the right. You can see quite clearly the ornate, if you see at the top, there's the ornate kind of, you can just see there's this is the entrance to the women's gallery, and you can see it's actually very, very beautiful, and the women's gallery is behind it. It's quite a small, it's not a great picture of the synagogue because I asked the girls who work in the synagogue complex, the museum, who I'm very close to, I asked them to take a photograph for me that I could show. I didn't really want to take anything off the net because I didn't want to have any problems in taking copyright or anything. So I asked them to take some pictures, and during COVID, it's full of boxes of masks. So she said she couldn't take the whole of it because she didn't want to show the boxes of masks. So, but you get a little bit of a picture on the right-hand side of the inside of the synagogue. The left-hand side, you can just see as you go in, there's a little entrance there, and that's the beginning. You can just see the beginning of the shul. I'd like to just point out on the right, you might just be able to make out a plaque there. There is a plaque on the right-hand side for people who perished during the Holocaust. Now, these were people who were from Pitigliano originally, but had moved out of the area, and they moved to Florence or Rome or Livorno, and they perished during the Holocaust. But they weren't from Pitigliano because the people in Pitigliano were saved. They were hidden when the Germans came in 43. Until that point, they were fine because they managed to carry on as per normal. When the Germans came in 43 after Italy surrendered, then it became much more complicated and they had to leave Pitigliano. But all the Jews from this village were saved. Let's have a look at the next picture. The reason that my story is a little bit darker than perhaps I had intended it to be, in my earlier drafts, even though I feel personally that it's a lot about little acts of kindness that people did, and I really wanted to show that. It became a little bit darker because I started to research outside of the area. And in 2013, there was the death of a famous Nazi called Erich Priebke, who was part of an organization. It was called SHPO. It was the Nazi, the Gestapo police based in Rome. And when he died, I started looking at what had happened during that time with this particular Nazi. And some of the stuff was really, really upsetting. And I thought, well, if I was writing a book that's an authentic account of what happened in Italy, rather than just what happened in Pitigliano, I had to make it more authentic. And then I started to research what happened with this particular man and what he did. And he was responsible for a terrible massacre, which I just mentioned in passing, but I think it's quite interesting to talk about it here. It was the massacre of the Fosse Ardeatine, just outside of Rome, where 365 people were killed, 76 were Jewish, and they were just murdered. And they were murdered because the week before, the partisans, the partigiani, had planted a bomb in Via Rasella in Rome, and they had killed a large number of Italians, fascists. But the people that they killed, they were a group from the north, from the Tyrol, which is the Alto Adige, right in the north. And this area used to be part of Austria until the First World War, and then it was annexed to Italy. But the people who lived there, and still live there today, actually, even today, they are very, very Germanic. So they are Italians with Italian passports, but they speak German as their first language. They have German newspapers, and they see themselves as German. And during the war, the area of the Alto Adige, it's around a town called Bolzano. Some of you may know it. It's in the Tyrol. And they were known as the Borsen, and they were Italian, but they really affiliated themselves to the Germans. And they had come down, their regiment had come down to Rome, and the partisans planted a bomb and killed 13 of them. And as a result, this Erich Priebke decided, right, they were going to kill for every German that's killed, they will kill 10 people, 10 partisans, but they just decided to take loads of civilians. They took them to these fosse, which is a ditch, and it's like a cave really, just outside of Rome, and they killed them. And when I discovered all this, I thought, I have to put this somehow in my book. And I have to show that it wasn't all rosy, because at this time, this period is not a rosy period. And although in Pitigliano, they did survive, they were saved, it's not a rosy period. And I had to authentically show that. So I did that by showing how this group from the Tyrol, from the Alto Adige, were involved. And I did that by weaving it through what happened with a couple of my characters. So I won't say too much for those of you who haven't read the book, but I wanted to thread in the story of him, of this Priebke and his boss, Erich Kappler, and I brought them into the story, and they actually do come to Pitigliano, or to Monterini, and they meet the congregants. And I wanted to show how Mussolini, I mean, he was really admired by many, many people, including Jews at the beginning, actually. Many Jews were part of the fascist movement. And that was interesting. And also he had his mistress, Margherita Zarfati, she was Jewish. So it was quite an interesting turn of events. And it wasn't till later that he changed. But even though he changed, in this area, it wasn't so difficult for the Jews until the Germans came. And then it really, really changed. Anyway, so I'm going to just show you the next slide. So this is my favorite room in that synagogue complex, in the museum complex. It's the room where they make the matzah, the pane asime. And I talk about this a lot in my book. Bella learns how to make pane asime when she goes and lives in the ghetto with her father. She moves from the fratto to the ghetto, and she learns how to make pane asime. And I love this room. It's always been my favorite rooms. My kids always say, when I talk about my favorite rooms, they say, oh, the matzah ovens. And this is the matzah ovens. And the women would come along here before Passover, and they would make the matzah. They would roll out the dough, and they would make the matzah. And there is another photo next where you see this is the photo above the matzah ovens, and you can see a little bit more clearly how they roll the dough and they prick it. So the matzah there has got little holes all the way around. It's really beautiful. And it's sometimes you can get sweetened matzah as well, and orange matzah. It's very, very nice. So these are the matzah ovens. That's my favorite room. This is a Seder. I wanted to show this photograph because I wanted to kind of explain how the Catholic-Jewish bond is so important in this particular village. And I thread this theme through my story in The Tears of Monterini. In 2017, we decided to do a Seder. They hadn't had a Seder in Pitigliano as a community for a very long time. And with the two girls that worked there, we arranged to do a Seder. We got all our food from Rome and we brought it up to Pitigliano. So there was Elena Servi, who is the lady who is responsible. She's in her 90s. She's responsible for keeping the history and the culture of Jewish Pitigliano alive. And so we made this Seder. We were four at my family, my two children, my husband, and Elena Servi were the only Jews at this Seder. And the rest were the two girls that work in the synagogue who are totally committed to the Jewish culture. In fact, one summer I went there and they started talking to me in Hebrew, Boker Tov, and I said, why are you talking Hebrew? So, we're doing a course to learn how to speak Hebrew, which I just thought was amazing. So there was the two girls there, another woman called Roberta who runs the shop where they sell all the kosher wine and the matzahs and all the lovely touristy things. And then there were other people who had been fundamentally involved in the organization La Piccola Gerusalemme, which means Little Jerusalem, which was the original name of the town. La Piccola is known as La Piccola Gerusalemme, and the synagogue complex, the organization, is also called La Piccola Gerusalemme. And the people that are involved in it are not Jewish. In fact, when I spoke to Elena Servi, she said that most people who pay every year to belong to the museum and the synagogue are not Jews, which I just thought was fascinating. A lot of people that we met in the village that we became close to also said, oh, we belong to the shul and we belong to the shul. And I found that really amazing. So we did our very first Seder there in the house that now is used as the rabbi's house. It's not the original rabbi's house, but it's used as the rabbi's house if they have a service from people come from Livorno or Rome and they want to have a service of a mitzvah or something special, and so there is a rabbi's house where the rabbi can stay. Okay, I'm going to show you. So the two on the right are the two girls, Claudia and Francesca, who work in the synagogue, totally committed to it, and Roberta is on the left, and she also works in the shop. And I'm going to show Elena Servi. So this is the most amazing woman. So she's 90, and I spent a lot of time with her. She's incredible. When we first bought our house, the synagogue and the museum was actually closed. It was under refurbishment, but we met her and we talked to her and we spoke a lot about her past and the past living in Pitigliano. She lived there after the war for a while. Yes, she was quite young during the war. She was about 4, and she told me in depth what happened to her family. Until the Germans arrived, they were fine, as was everybody else who lived there. When the Germans came, they had to leave, and they all left, as my characters do in the book. And she was hidden with her family just outside Pitigliano. And the man that was responsible for saving her family was a man called Fortunato Sono, who is actually mentioned, and I just must get this right, in The Righteous Amongst the Nations in Yad Vashem. So he is mentioned there, and he was responsible for saving her. And I based my character, Angelo, on Fortunato Sono. And Fortunato Sono used to go every day on his donkey to give food and medicines to Eleanor's family. And he is mentioned, as I just said, in the Yad Vashem. But we got friendly with a lot of people in the village, and people we knew would then tell me stories. My uncle took food, and my father was a doctor and he used to bring all his medicines, and they took food to this family or that family. And it was really lovely to hear these stories, which I then wove as well into my book. Okay. Right, I wanted to show this. I didn't have this originally in my in my presentation, but I just decided yesterday, I said to my husband, can you quickly find me a picture of a Sfratti and stick it in so I can show everyone? Because I think this is quite an interesting story, the Sfratti. I again mention it in my book. And when we first started our very initial walk down through the streets of Pitigliano and looked in the shop windows and saw kosher wine and saw matzah, which obviously we knew, we also saw these and we didn't know what they were. And they're called Sfratti. So I'm just going to take a quick drink of water. They're called Sfratti, and I then did a lot of research on what Sfratti was, and they are typically Jewish cakes from Pitigliano. It's only from Pitigliano, and although nowadays you can maybe find Sfratti just outside in the shops in the other towns, it is from that town only. And what it means, sfrattare means in Italian to evict, and sfratto is an eviction. So in the I think it was in the 18th century, after the Count Orsini, who was really lovely to the Jews and welcomed them in, there was another count called the Count Medici, and he was not very nice to the Jews. He didn't like them at all. And that was when the ghetto in Pitigliano was built. And when he fell out with them, he would send his soldiers, along with their long batons, to knock on the houses and tell the Jews, sfrattare, to get back inside the ghetto walls. And that was where they became known as sfratto, which was little sfratti, which is these cakes. And they're filled with walnuts and honey. And the thing that I found also very interesting, which was another thing to really reflect this very, very close bond between the Catholics and the Jews, is that the Jews always had this to commemorate the eviction, but they had this for New Year. So every Rosh Hashanah, they would eat and make sfratti. And now every New Year, to celebrate the New Year in Pitigliano, the Catholics eat sfratti. So I found that story really lovely, and that's also mentioned in my book. Am I okay for time? Am I okay for time? Shall I keep going for a moment? I'm just going to mention this wonderful gentleman. His name is Marino. He is a very close friend of mine. I sometimes joke to my husband, I call him my Italian boyfriend. He's wonderful. The picture on the left, he's 90. The picture on the right, he's a bit older, he's 93 there. On the left, this was the year that we decided, in 2017, when we decided to do the Seder. And I was walking in the streets and he was there with this wheelbarrow full of wine. I mean, he's 90 at the time. He's pushing this wheelbarrow full of wine and cheese, which he had made himself. He's just the most incredible man. Now, unfortunately, his wife died and he had to move to the old age home there. And I go and see him every time in Pitigliano. I go and see him, and he talked to me a lot about his life. He was a partisan. He was 17 during the war, and he was a partisan. And he was telling me what it was like to be a partisan at that time. And so I loosely based my character of Rico around him. It's not him and it's not his story, but the things that he told me, I gleaned information to be able to furnish my character with what it was like being a partisan. And he told me some fabulous, really interesting things of what it was like at the time living in Pitigliano, which was under the regime of the fascists. He wasn't. He was very socialist minded, very anti-fascist, as were also many of the intellectual Jews at the time. I'll just mention now, a lot of people always say to me, but you know, so many Jews were deported from Italy at the beginning, and quite often before 1943, the Jews that were deported were Jews that were anti-fascist. They weren't deported because they were Jewish, they were deported because they were against the fascist regime. And Primo Levi always said, when you are in Italy, you declare the Hebrew part. You say that you're Jewish. As soon as you're sent over the border, if you're sent over the border, you declare the anti-fascist part, the communist part, because in Italy, it was so much harder being against the fascist regime than being Jewish until 43. And he told me these amazing stories of what it was like. And he escaped a prison in the north, and he managed to come barefoot with two other guys from Pitigliano, and he managed to get to Pitigliano, and he hid in a cave just outside of Pitigliano. And I don't know, I can't remember exactly how his mother knew, but I think she knew where he was going to be because he discussed this with her before he left, and she knew where he was going to be, so she came to find him to bring him clothes and food. And the fascist leaders of the town followed her and caught him and took him to what became a prison. They used it as a prison during this period, and it's right next to the cathedral, which I also talk about in my book. And he was sent there and imprisoned there, and by people that he knew, because everybody in the town knows everyone else. And I asked him what it was like after the war then, how he managed to live with people that had imprisoned him and had caught him. And it was really amazing how he said, well, you know, we just got on with our lives and we carried on, and it was over, and we just saw each other every day, and that was it. And he said, you know, and some of them, a lot of them have died now, but he said, you know, I saw them and that was it. And we carried on and they carried on. And I thought that was a very interesting story as well, how people can be tolerant of others who may not have treated you badly, and how people can accept. And I thought he was a remarkable gentleman. Okay, I'm going to show you this one. This is a really lovely photograph of the villa, which I use in my book. And you can actually see some of the children here. These were the children that were actually brought over from the former Yugoslav Republic, from Germany, orphans who were given a chance in this villa. It belonged to a Jewish man who fled, and he gave it to this organization, De La Sem, and they were kept here until a particular event happens, which I won't mention because it's giving too much away, but the actual event happens in my book. I keep the story very much as it really was in reality. And they are kept there until they couldn't stay there any longer. And when they weren't able to stay there any longer, they were hidden by Catholic priests and by people in the village, and till they could get to safety. And it's a really beautiful story. And I think the thing that I found so fascinating about this era was finding all these nuggets of stories of what people did, lovely, kind acts that were just so inspiring at a time that was really dark. Okay, this is just a lovely photograph of Pitiliano, of the village. And this is my book. My son went to Pitiliano at a time when we aren't traveling as a family, but my son managed to find a couple of days off work to disappear 2 weeks ago. And he took my book and took a photograph of it just outside our house in our street, which I was really happy about. And he also took a copy to Eleanor Servey, who doesn't speak a word of English and probably won't be able to read it, but I dedicated it partly to her and partly to my daughter. And so I wanted her to have a copy. So there's a picture of him there. Okay, and I'm just going to finish with, that is my book. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So that's basically my inspiration for the story, why I was so inspired by this particular era and by the individuals of the village who I got to know and became very friendly with. And that's my story in a nutshell. So if there are any questions, I'd be really happy to answer them if I can.
Amanda, that was wonderful.
A bit long, sorry, it went on a little bit too long, sorry.
We're doing very, very well. It really was wonderful, and what a privilege to fall in love with a village, and obviously the village to embrace you, which is very special. But to be sort of a little bit serious on this, I mean, what you know, I've only read 50 pages so far of the book, but it's so far about tolerance. You know, the characters, one Jewish, one not, and Catholic. So there's a lot of tolerance at the moment. But what do we learn from history? At the moment, you know, new right-wing parties are forming in Italy, in parts of Europe. Tolerance seems to always get swamped by intolerance. I mean, do we learn anything from this history?
Well, Lawrence, what I feel is, what I think we learn from history is actually that we don't learn from history, because it's repeated over and over again. And you think, you know, after the horrors of the Holocaust and the Nazi period and the fascist period, that we would learn, but we don't, because you know, there are so many horrific things that have happened since then. And you know, in 2017, Salvini launched the Lega, which is a really right-wing fascist party, dreadful. And some of the things that have happened in Italy since then have been really horrific as well. And And I just feel that they've learned nothing. They've learned nothing from it. And it was a really, really tough period for Italians. I've read quite a bit. I don't know if anybody's read any Natalia Ginsburg. She's an incredible writer and very badly translated in English, I must say, really badly. But I did manage to read one of her books in Italian, and it's all about after the period after the war and how difficult it was for the Italians to come to terms with being a fascist nation, but not really being. The Italian individuals are a very tolerant nation, and they had to deal with being a fascist country, but with tolerant hearts. And I thought that was really, really interesting to read this. And her story was all about, it's all about omission. It was about what she didn't say that happened and how people couldn't actually talk about it because it was just so painful. And then in 2017, this party was launched, which is a fascist party. And I felt, have we not learned anything? And I think the truth is we don't learn. And all we can remember, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I think all we can remember and all we can really be inspired by and rejoice are the tiny acts of kindness that individuals make. And I'm just going to mention now about this pandemic. We are going through a really difficult time in the world with this pandemic. And what has got me through the pandemic is seeing the tiny acts of kindness that people have done for each other. I've been quite involved with the Jewish Volunteer Network, and I was looking at all the things that people were prepared to do to help others during this pandemic. And it's not a war, but it's a kind of a war that we've got with the virus. And I think what gets us through is being kind to others. And you know, when we look at politicians and we look at, you know, that nothing's been learned, all we can remember is to be kind to one another. And I think that's what I was trying to put forward in the book before it became a bit too dark. But that's what I was trying to show, that tiny acts of kindness are what's really, really important. I hope that answers your question in a bit of a nutshell.
Barry, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, that was fascinating, Amanda. Very, very interesting. We actually, my wife and I actually did go to Pitigliano in the 90s as well, and saw the shul. I seem to remember that we were told that the Italian government now pays for the maintenance of the synagogue. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I do. It isn't the Italian government. It's actually the local comune. The local comune is involved. They don't pay for it. They pay half towards it, and the rest they have to get themselves through donations or through entrance fees, or all the things that, you know, my daughter actually gave quite a few, she's an artist, and she gave quite a few cards and paintings to the museum, which they then sold and was their profit. She gave that to them, which was really nice. So the half they have to get themselves and the other half is from the comune. But actually it's a really, really good point, because the comune, which is like the town hall, I suppose, they are so full of love for the synagogue. They're not able to give any more money than what they do, but they really helped to refurbish it in the late 1990s. When you went there, it probably was closed because they didn't reopen it until about 2003. It had collapsed in the 60s, and they did quite a lot of work, and it was finally reopened in the early 2000s. And from then on, it's suddenly become quite well known over the years. In the last 20 odd years, it's become much more known, and people do go and visit it. And the girls told me last year it was, I think they had something like 300,000 people, which is amazing, much more than any other site there, more than the palace or the cathedral or anything. It's the site, so they were very proud of that. Yeah, so the woman is involved. But I know that she's really, really struggling with the cemetery, because the cemetery is collapsing as well, and she can't get enough money from the comune to help her with the graves. And, you know, helping a cemetery is not something that a lot of people are interested in giving their money to. They'd rather give it to the synagogue than to the cemetery. But that's what she's trying to raise money for at the moment.
And also the kosher wine, we bought some kosher wine there that actually, I think, came from a vineyard very close to Pitigliano.
Yes.
There is a kosher vineyard, or a part of a vineyard that makes kosher wine.
They make kosher wine, and they bring a rabbi in, obviously, who blesses the wine. Yes. Yes. And it's called, the wine is called La Piccola Gerusalemme.
Yes.
Little Jerusalem. And the reason also that it's called Little Jerusalem, it's got this really incredible golden color which is why it was known as Little Jerusalem, because it's this incredible golden colour when you first see it.
Thank you.
Are there some questions in the chats?
Gillian and Tom, you got a question?
Yeah, a fascinating talk, Amanda. Really very interesting. I'm dying to go there now. As soon as the pandemic's over, we're definitely going. I just wondered if the book is known in the town, if it's sold in the town, and if you've managed to have it translated into Italian.
Unfortunately, it's not been translated. I'd love to have it translated in Italian, but it's not really something I can do. It has to be my publishers, Red Door. So I am kind of pushing them, but it's not that easy, particularly at the moment. But I would love to have it translated in Italian. I've given 3 copies, one to one of the girls who works in the synagogue. She does actually speak a little bit of English. Eleanor Survey doesn't. Most people there don't speak English, actually, as it happens. Some of the younger generation have begun to. But when we first arrived, I mean, you couldn't manage without Italian. Luckily, I had a bit of Italian from university, but my husband learnt it, my kids learnt, and you just couldn't manage. And I think even now you do really need Italian there. So unless the book is translated, it will be quite difficult for people of the town to read it. But there are stories that have been written by people there on the non-fiction side about the stories of the Jews and the Catholics, and very, very poorly translated, I must say, not well translated at all, but they do have the story, and they are sold in the synagogue. But maybe one day I'll be able to take the books and see if they'll sell it there. The problem is we haven't been there this year because of this dreadful pandemic. You can't really go.
I'm pretty sure the tourists who would buy the book in the synagogue.
That would be nice, wouldn't it? Even if it's in English.
Eleanor Levy.
Hi, thank you so much. What a natural storyteller you are, Amanda, and how lucky this small town is that you found it. A few questions. You mentioned a ghetto a few times, and I'm not sure of the era of that ghetto and what happened during the war, after the war. I wonder if you could just tell us.
Okay, so the ghetto is on the east side of the town, and the ghetto was actually devised in the 18th century by Medici, and he then sent all the Jews into the ghetto. He didn't get on with them as well as the Orsini. So that's when the ghetto was first built in Pitigliano, and it's still there, and it is lovely. And no Jews live in the ghetto now, and Eleanor Survey doesn't live there. She lives in the new town, but you still get the lovely feel of it. The synagogue is there. Actually, a story that I thought was really interesting. It was about 4 or 5 years ago. There were a lot of terrorists. Do you remember that period we had lots and lots of terrorist attacks on Jewish sites? And in Italy, they were worried about the synagogue. So the government actually sent the armed forces to protect the synagogue. And I thought that was incredible. We had all the Italian military outside the synagogue with their guns, making sure that nobody would do anything to it. And I thought that was really nice. And that was in the ghetto area. After the war, a lot of people did leave, and they went, even just a little bit before the war, they went to larger towns because the community had shrunk and it was quite small. So they went to Florence and Livorno and Rome. And I don't think many went to Milan. It was mainly in that part in central Italy that they stayed. But during the 16th and 17th century, the density of the Jews there was really large. It was about 15–16%, which was quite large for that time. It was a big community, and they had a yeshiva and they had a library, and it was a big community of Jews. So that was interesting. And the thing that I found so amazing was that even though there's only one Jew there, they are so determined to keep the life and the culture flourishing. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, well done you. How amazing this is.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah. Hold on, looking for more hands. Okay. I can't pronounce your...
Sekach?
I'm not surprised. My name is Judith Sekach-Weiss.
I know who you are. We've met.
Yeah.
We've met in Pitigliano with your husband.
I'm so happy that Gillian alerted me to your talk today, and I really enjoy it, and I'm very happy to be here.
Oh, I'm so happy to see you. Do you remember we met in
Yes,
Pitiliano in the synagogue
we
with your
nearly
husband?
went to that Seder in 17.
That's right. I invited you to come to the Seder, but you couldn't come. I
Yeah,
invited you. I remember. Oh, so glad that you are here. Let's talk.
yeah. So you know, my story could be long, but I try to put it very very short. So we went with my husband, as Amanda says, I think a few years later than you, as visitors, because we are based in Toscana, a bit far away, and we were looking for Jewish roots and heritage. And those years I read a lot about now a lot. Elena said we started to write about their project of Piccolo Gerusalemme. And I was very, very curious what it was like. Was it a tourist trap, or was it real, or what was it? So we went and we got to know Elena, and then we went back many many years, and also try to support the museum and their whole project. It's really really something um, not only lovely but very very precious, and on an individual story as well, how Elena and her family or son try to revive Jewish culture and Jewish life in a village that nobody except for Amanda has heard of those times, and how they succeeded in getting support and donations, and actually restore not only the synagogue but also the museum, and they are teaching Jewish life there, even if there are very very few Jews. And I think what I would like to say now, as Amanda touched upon the lessons of this story, against the background of history, that yes, I think Elena always said that there were 60 families in Pitiliano, 60 Jewish families, and after the war only one or two families returned, and the mission was to bring back also the Jews. So oddly enough, and maybe this is a very interesting lesson we could think about, they managed to revive the building, they managed to revive the museum, they managed to revive, interest. They didn't manage really to revive Jewish life, even in spite of what Amanda and family does, and how difficult it is. They have a conference center, and they have also a society called the Società Piccolo Gerusalemme, which is a cultural society also about tolerance and about Christians and Jews, and it's a very very interesting. I tried to look for a photo on my mobile. I do have their last the posters.
And
it is really 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 very interesting how one can help maintain and survive something as important as roots and stories and lives. And thank you for your talk.
It reminds me, actually, something I forgot to mention. When we first went there, they did have the cultural day. The cultural day for the Jewish Cultural Day was always the first day of the Pitiliano festival. And it was just before Rosh Hashanah, it was the end of August, and it was always before Rosh Hashanah. So Eleanor Servi asked us to make honey cake. Yes, that's yeah, I can just about see it. She asked us to make honey cake so that we could show people what we had in part of our culture. So we'd have on the first day of the Pitiliano festival would be the Jewish day, and we would go along, I'd make honey cake, and we'd take the honey cake, we'd have the kosher wine, and we'd have the matzahs. And then I think this was the second year we were there was a klezmer band, and we were standing, it was Julian, myself, my two little children, Eleanor Servi, the only Jews there, with this klezmer band in this medieval village in Italy, full of Catholics, with a klezmer band eating honey cake. It was bizarre. And another really, really interesting story is because I became known for having my honey cakes, a few years later, they did a cake festival, or I was told it was a cake festival. So one of the guys that organizes a lot of the events said, "Oh, we've got a cake festival. Would you make your honey cake?" And I thought, oh, he was from the Comune. I better do it. He told me to do it. I said to June, oh God, I've got to make another honey cake for this festival. So I mentioned it to my Italian neighbor, and she said, oh, for the cake competition. And I said, oh, is it a competition? She said, yes, it's a competition. I thought, well, I can't do a honey cake for a competition. You know, it's a very plain looking cake, might taste nice, but very boring, very plain to look at. But I mentioned it to the man. He said, oh, no, you can't possibly not get out of it now. You have to do this honey cake. So I thought, what am I going to do? So everyone from the town brought along their amazing cakes. It was like a leaning tower of Pisa and beautiful things, a Sistine Chapel in the cake and my honey cake. And I felt very embarrassed. So my husband takes my honey cake up to them. There's a line in the square with all the judges. He takes the honey cake up. They look at it. They don't look at it, give it a funny look. So what actually is it? So he said in Italian, "È una torta ebrea." It's a Jewish cake. And their eyes pop out of their heads. All of a sudden, my honey cake becomes a really important cake because it's a Jewish cake. And it came second, which is really lovely. So that just shows again the importance of the collaboration in a way between the Jews and the Catholics and how important it is to them. And I do agree with you. And yet Eleanor works so hard at trying to bring Jews in. There is another Jewish family. I don't know if you've ever met him, but they are from Rome, and he spends a lot of time there as well. So there is another family involved. Yeah. So maybe one day we'll all live there. Who knows?
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah. But anyway, lovely to see you. Really, really lovely.
Thank you very much for your input. I'll take one more question. We've gone past midday. Andrea. Andrea, you need to unmute.
I so loved your story. You're such a wonderful storyteller. I'm sure we've all loved it. I bought your book on Amazon whilst I was listening to you.
Oh, thank you.
From 1970 to 1980, I worked as a tour guide in Italy, taking Americans around Italy. So I particularly loved everything you said. Thank you very much for giving us such a wonderful hour.
Oh, thank you so much. It was lovely to be here. Really lovely. Thank you.
Amanda.
Are there any other questions before we finish, or we are out of time?
I think we're out of time.
Eddie.
Eddie?
Unmute, Eddie. Eddie, can you unmute?
He is unmuted.
Yes,
Patty?
I just wanted to say how incredibly lucky that village was to find you as well as finding them, because what a wonderful
contribution.
Thank you. I feel very blessed to have found it, actually. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and hopefully see you next week. Even the new faces who just came to see Amanda, you're more than welcome to join us on Sunday morning at 11 for My Story.
It's going to be a treat. It's going to be an absolute treat again next week.
Thank you.
Can I just say a thank you to you, Lawrence, for inviting me, and to everybody for being there. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you about my book and about the village I love, and I really appreciate everybody's presence. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Really great.
Thank you.
Have a good week, everyone.
You too. Bye.